God puts us in nations, in places, not by mistake, but to do a job. What if we opened our eyes to the needs of our colleagues, of our leaders, of our subordinates, and we were a priest on their behalf? Welcome to the Repurposing Business Podcast. My name is Brett Johnson.
And I'm Len Johnson.
And we're going to be talking about how to get our business into God's business. Our subtext is Let My Business Go, and we'll have guests from around the world. So thank you for joining us this week and every week on the Repurposing Business Podcast. Welcome to the Repurposing Business Podcast and to Season 5, When Capital Meets Eternity. The objective of this particular session is to give you some backstory before I interview guests from around the world with wonderful perspectives on this issue. Now, you might wonder why we need another series on capital when there is so much happening in the world right now that is really good on the topic of capital from many perspectives. From the regular business perspective, there is a look at ESG or investing that deals with environmental, social, governance type of issues. There is patient capital, impact investing, many developments which are positive. But the theme of this particular podcast is when capital meets eternity, and of course I believe there's a bit of a disconnect between capital and eternity. I believe that we're in for a huge change in what happens around us in this current season. Perhaps one of the biggest changes, a friend told me recently, since World War II. Now you might think, well, we're not having a war, but the real winners of World War II were Germany, the United States, and Switzerland, arguably. Why? Because coming out of that chaos, they set up the economic structures which have dominated the world for the last 60 or 70 years. So the winners were not the allies, but those who won economically and who positioned themselves to win economically. And as we go through a sea change, a major change in finances in the world, there will be those who are structuring and positioning to be at an advantage. But most of this is actually temporal. In fact, capital often pulls people towards the temporary. This is even true for multi-generational families. You can knock the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds and the others who have had a multi-generational legacy, but they've understood something of the principles of household that we see in Scripture. And let's not criticize them for doing this. However, there is an eternal use of capital. There is an eternal perspective on capital. And that's what we'll be exploring in this series. Now, in some respects, I'm not qualified to be doing this podcast series, but I do have a lot of friends around the world who are eminently qualified to speak on different aspects of capital and on this theme of when capital meets eternity. Just to give you some of my background, I don't have a family office. I'm not a large private investor or public investor. I didn't work in Silicon Valley and cash out. I worked there, but I didn't cash out. And so why would you listen to me speaking about when capital meets eternity? Well, over the years, as I'll share in a moment, I've got some understanding of the comprehensive capitalization of initiatives. So financial capital, spiritual capital, intellectual capital, relational capital, the plethora of capital that goes into making something successful, particularly an initiative that is a kingdom initiative. And going back in my story, I have two grandfathers, one who had quite a bit of money financially, and then in terms of stewarding that, didn't pass it on to the next generation well, from my perspective. Secondly, a grandfather who had tremendous spiritual capital and did a good job in passing that on. And so, as I looked at that, I learned that one needs to steward capital intergenerationally. And capital has to have a purpose. Capital always has an agenda, always carries an agenda. So we need to understand it well. Well, moving on from my years in South Africa, I moved to Silicon Valley with Pricewaterhouse and began to work with them, working with large multinational clients, working in areas of innovation, working with executives. And as I got to meet people in Silicon Valley, I went on from Pricewaterhouse to KPMG to Computer Sciences Corporation. In the late 1990s, started the Institute for Innovation, Integration and Impact. And I remember it was in 1997, I was considering the competencies that we needed within our new company. God had clearly spoken about starting the business, and I was thinking about leadership, innovation, integration, the different things we need. And I remember God saying to me clear as day, you have a hang-up with capital. I was a little bit shocked. Why did I have a problem with capital? Well, part of it was coming out of my background as a Christian, where Christians had a view of living in the economy of the desert rather than the economy of the promised land. That was held up as optimum. And I had to change my thinking. I began speaking with well-known Christians who were senior partners in big investment firms, and they taught me something about capital. But at that time, there was a bit of a mystery, or a myth rather, that was out there, which said the problem with Christians is that they undertake small initiatives and they don't ask for much money. And there's tons of money floating around Silicon Valley, and if only people would ask for a big enough amount of money, the capital would be forthcoming. Well, I discovered that that wasn't true. I remember when I asked the first person for $1 million to go not to me, but to a project we were working on for an NGO. The guy nearly choked on his salad and eventually gave $25,000. Now, what I found then, that there were these foundations set up by Christians, but they strained at gnats. They had such tight criteria for putting money into any kingdom endeavors, and normally the amount that was put in was a fraction of what was in the foundation. The second thing that happened round about that time is we were in Silicon Valley at the time of the dot-com bubble, if you like, and there was a lot of money floating around. And in fact, paper money wise, there was billions of dollars that sat in the hands of God's people. And the response I noticed was that many of them built barns. If you remember the parable that Jesus told about the gentleman who was very wealthy, and he tore down his small barns and he put up a big barn. And what are those barns today? They're family foundations, they are private foundations. People were hiring directors, setting up their criteria, what they would do with all this money, etc. And overnight, much of it was gone. I have a suspicion that there was enough money there to fund the completion of the Great Commission, if you like, and it disappeared. It was a lost opportunity. Then fast forward, we began working with companies on this whole question of how do you get a business into God's business? How do you repurpose a business? How do you give a business a purpose that is completely aligned with what God is doing in the world? And we did that for about 5 years, and I noticed that even though we'd worked with hundreds of companies, there was still a problem. And the problem was manifest in various ways. One was greed, the other was fear, and another was control. And it all got down to this question of money. So although they had given their businesses to God, although they'd invited many of them God to be the CEO, although some had even signed over their shareholding to God, there was still a fundamental issue. And it got to this issue of capital, of finances. And so we began in 2008 delivering what was one of the most difficult and yet important series of talks that I gave on kingdom economics. And did that in Johannesburg first, Jakarta, South Africa, San Francisco, San Jose, LA, Seattle, Portland, other parts of the US and parts of the world. So that began in 2008, trying to deal with this issue of capital and faith. Just going back a little prior to that, I remember in 2006, it was 4th of July, I was about to meet with a man whose goal was to give away $1 billion. And I thought that was laudable. Now, he didn't have $1 billion, but his goal was he would generate it and give it away. And I was going to be meeting with him, and thinking about that conversation, I went for a walk, was chatting with God. And the concept came to mind about starting a foundation or a trust that would fund businesses that would deal with global giants. Now, in our business, as we'd worked with companies and challenged them to integrate the tackling of large societal problems, global giants, into their business plans, we noticed several things. God was giving believers, people of faith, great product ideas and business ideas. You could call these inspired innovations, and yet the missing ingredient was capital. In fact, those more traditional investors thought that the people with the crazy ideas were crazy, that these were wild and woolly Christians who heard God, but they didn't have a big or large organizational quotient. They had a big spiritual quotient, maybe a big intellectual quotient, but they didn't understand the world of organizations and capital. And then on the other hand, I saw the inventors. Because God had given them the idea, they were so possessive of these ideas and careful to guard them, and they were suspicious of the people with money. And they viewed people with capital as being greedy, opportunistic, quote-unquote capitalistic, but not tuned into what God was really doing. And so there was this big disconnect. And we began to conceive of a way to have an organization in the middle, an entity, a function that would bridge the inventors and the investors. Proceeding on from there, in about 2009, 2010, early 2010, I became aware that following the global financial crisis in 2008, where there had been the big bank bailout with no real change to the underlying systems except for this quantitative easing, the huge bailout of the banks. There'd been no big change, and yet the government was considering, various governments around the world, the offer from those who were proposing Islamic finance or Islamic banking. And the story from Islamic finance professors was, if you had Islamic finance, you wouldn't have had this crash. You wouldn't have had the interest problems. You wouldn't have had the debt problems. And so why not consider basing your economy on Sharia law, Islamic finance, Islamic banking? Fair question. Well, where were the Christians when this was being proposed? I remember meeting with two gentlemen in an African country talking about Islamic finance. And these were both proponents of Islamic finance for their nation. And they said to me, where do I go to get the Christian perspective on banking? This was after I'd explained to them some of the history of finance, how the first life insurance companies were started by Scottish Presbyterians, how early banking had been zero interest for 1,000 years, how Christians had been involved in setting up the first banks in India, Germany, the US, and so on. And I explained this history to them, which they didn't understand. Even Barclays Bank was started by Puritans, Quakers. So, where do you get the Christian perspective? Now, I understand why you don't have Christian banking, quote unquote, separate from regular banking. I understand that. You're there to serve everybody if you run a bank. However, the principles of finance have become so far divorced from the principles of faith-based financing and capital that we see in Scripture, so far divorced that we need a reset. If we claim to be people of God, we need to be looking at this whole topic of capital through the eyes of Scripture and with an eye on eternity, not just on today. So this is why we're doing this series. I believe that over the rest of this year, as we tackle these topics, we will get insights and understanding that will equip us, empower us, ask good questions, perhaps even suggest some answers on alternative ways to think about systems of capital, to think about money, investing, how we measure impact, and how we connect capital and eternity. So join me in the weeks to come. Perhaps you know a lot of this stuff. The reality, however, is that we have much more work to do. I've been encouraged to see Christians get more involved in investing. That's great. I've been encouraged by impact investing, faith-based initiatives to fund projects, patient capital, grants, the increased generosity of people of faith. And that is fantastic. However, we have yet to tackle things at a level that changes systems and changes nations. I remember chatting with a friend many years ago, perhaps 15 years ago in Cape Town, and I asked, what is the biggest challenge that you see in Africa? And he and his organization had been working throughout Africa. His response was, the Muslims are buying up the place. Now, don't knock the Muslims. They have a more integrated view very often of their faith and their use of capital or business. And we as Christians do not have a strategic enough view that says, what is it going to take to bless the nations in Africa? What is it going to take to comprehensively capitalize businesses, organizations, products, people, NGOs that will then bring about transformation in society? This is a large initiative. And part of the problem is that our concepts around finances are finite, are linked so solidly to this quarter, this year, even 5 years. I spoke with somebody else in Chattanooga, and they're involved in impact investing. And they said Christians come to them and talk about, I have a calling, I want to do this, invest in my business. And when they look at the term sheets, it's no different from the term sheets that you would get from anybody that's looking for investment. In other words, there's an exit clause after 3 years or 5 years. Well, how do you exit from your calling? If this is your life calling and you want me to invest in you because you believe this is your calling, why do you have such stupid term sheets? We have to rethink these things as we connect capital and eternity. So that is the broad topic, when capital meets eternity. Now, one final word on eternity. Philosophers have looked at this topic of eternity for a long time. Of course, God is outside of time. Time is a construct that we understand. And God is eternal. From his perspective, the past, the future, the present are all happening in a now sense. And so it's impossible to divorce capital from eternity. But it is possible to have higher uses for capital than just the uses we find with investing as usual, saving as usual, business as usual. So I look forward to exploring these topics with you in the weeks to come.